Have you ever found yourself reaching for food when you're stressed, angry, anxious, bored, when you're feeling down? Well, you're not alone. This happens to so many women, me included, and even men. And we kind of tend to feel embarrassed about it or feel alone with it. I don't know, when I still struggle with my relationship with food and struggle with emotional eating, I felt embarrassed about it. Like, I didn't feel like it's something to talk about, and I felt ashamed of it. Emotional eating is a common coping mechanism, but it can lead to a cycle of shame-triggered binges and other unhealthy habits. In this episode, we will explore how to recognize patterns of emotional eating, how to see what kind of things or what kind of emotions trigger your emotional eating, and then, of course, talk about strategies on how to cope with your emotions and build healthier habits that nourish your mind, body, and soul. Building that awareness of what triggers your emotions or building that awareness around emotional eating in general is the first step in healing. Emotional eating is when we use food for purposes other than nourishment. So instead for coping with our emotions when we don't really know, or when we use food to cope with our emotions. So this can be whether you're eating because of stress, boredom, anger, anxiety, because you feel alone. It doesn't matter what it is. Understanding the root cause will help you break the cycle. And that's what exactly we will talk about here today. Emotional eating is driven by emotional hunger and not that actual physical hunger. Let's distinguish between the two. Emotional hunger is when the food craving or the hunger suddenly arises, and then also when it's more so a craving to a specific food versus just being hungry and you could eat whatever. And it's that need for instant gratification. The actual physical hunger is you could eat everything. Like you're hungry, you're happy to eat a banana. It doesn't have to be that cookies you're craving when you're emotionally hungry. So you can easily start by distinguishing between the two. Emotional hunger comes up fast, is for something specific, usually high sugary food, whereas actual physical hunger takes time to develop or takes time to get stronger and stronger, and you could eat almost anything you like to satisfy that hunger. So in today's episode, we will talk about emotional hunger and the things that can trigger it. And here I have to say that emotional eating in itself is not bad. It's okay to sometimes turn to food to satisfy your cravings, your emotional cravings with food, right? It's completely fine to, when you're sad, sometimes eat that bar of chocolate. The problem, however, arises when, first of all, it's the only way of coping, when you constantly do it, but also when it's about escaping yourself, your life, or filling a void. Emotional eating isn't the actual problem, which we often think it is. The problem is that we are not able to cope with our emotions in healthy ways, that we are not able to face our emotions in ways that will benefit us versus constantly eating. And this problem can be due to different reasons, like past trauma from the childhood, body image, limiting beliefs. So we will also talk a little bit about those things very, very soon. And as you can see, or by now hopefully understand, emotional eating isn't your problem. It's just a symptom of not being able to handle your emotion that are triggered by whatever the root cause is. And before I dive into the different triggers, I just want to mention that emotional eating is also linked to positive emotions. So, or even events like eating more on holidays or eating something because because you're happy and you eat something. And as long as it doesn't trigger guilt or shame, which then lead to that binging or that negative emotional eating cycle that brings more stress, it is completely fine, But once you, for example, on Christmas, you eat a few cookies, it's perfectly fine, no? Even if you're not hungry, it's more an emotional hunger, right? But if you feel guilty about it, that's when the problem could arise, because that means that you don't have that healthy relationship with yourself and the food. If it's just occasionally and if you don't feel guilt or shame, completely fine. Now let's move on into the triggers. So the emotions that trigger emotional eating or also the things that could potentially trigger the emotions that then trigger you to eat. Along that, I will also share with you some questions that you could ask yourself to identify how your relationship with food is in that aspect. So whether this could be a trigger for you or whether not. So for this, let's start with emotional and stress triggers. Emotions as triggers can be emotions like sadness, anxiety, loneliness, anger, or whatever it is could be for you. You will hopefully identify this soon. And these emotions then lead you to use food as a way to escape or to control and change how you feel. And if you don't respond to these emotions in healthy ways, the emotional cravings can quickly turn into food cravings, as I mentioned. So if you don't manage your emotions in healthy ways, if you don't cope them with how we were supposed to cope with them, in air quotes, the cravings will come up because you probably, if you've been doing it for a while, you learn that this will help you deal with it, even though in the future it triggers shame and guilt that make you feel bad, that in the future you realize you actually don't want to do it. Some questions you could ask yourself to help you there is, what specific emotions tend to lead you to eat even when you're not physically hungry? Or how do you typically respond to feelings of sadness, anger, anxiety, or whatever the feeling could be for you? And here, of course, I also want to mention boredom, because feeling bored can sometimes lead to emotional eating because we don't really know what to do with our time. We kind of feel frustrated, so it's maybe linked to another emotion. And additionally, a lack of variety in your diet. So boredom from what you eat can also trigger those kind of cravings. So questions to ask yourself here are, how do you usually spend your time in your free time? And does boredom often lead to snacking? Are there certain times of the day when you feel more inclined to eat out of habit? So it's a habit because you don't really know what to do, you know? For example, me, when I watch TV sometimes or a series, sometimes I kind of feel bored by it. So I have that craving to eat something with it to at least have something happen. It's like hard, sometimes these things are hard to explain, but when you ask yourself those questions, hopefully you will identify how emotional eating will show or does show up in your life, and hopefully you can start becoming aware and make shifts from there. Then stress is another significant trigger, often leading to cravings for comfort food. So that's why it's important to explore your personal stress cycles and understand how stress affects your eating habit. Because a stress cycle, like a negative stress cycle, is when our stress triggers thoughts and emotions that then trigger a maladaptive behavior, which then would be here in that case, the eating. And on top of that, the high cortisol levels, the hormone cortisol, the stress hormone, is present in higher amounts in your system. This triggers more cravings. So when you're stressed, you naturally have more cravings, especially for that high sugary, quick energy boosting foods, right? So you are kind of like fighting a double pull because your emotions lead you to eating, plus the cravings that arise because of the higher cortisol levels. A question you can ask yourself here is, how does stress affect your eating patterns, and what foods do you usually crave during stressful times? Now let's move on to root causes of those triggering emotions, the things that could potentially trigger the emotions. Because some of us maybe don't always eat emotionally when we feel a certain emotion. Sometimes it is because this emotion was triggered by something that actually, because that triggered that emotion is what leads us to eat, if that makes sense. So one thing could be self-sabotage and limiting beliefs that could trigger your emotional eating. Because limiting beliefs and self-sabotage are subconscious ways where we try to keep ourselves in our comfort zones, to keep ourselves around the familiar. We don't realize it. It's subconsciously because as humans or our brains crave the familiar. We don't crave change. That's why it is so hard to change. And that's why even when we try to do positive changes, it can feel so hard, and those limiting beliefs can throw us off track, leading to cravings in a way to fit in or stay close to the familiar. So when it comes to food, maybe you try to be healthier or have a healthier lifestyle, but your limiting beliefs could keep you stuck and trigger the emotional cravings and the emotional eating. So you can kind of see it as a subconscious excuse to remain in our comfort zones. It is quite complex. Questions to help you there. Are there any limiting beliefs or self-sabotaging thoughts that lead you to it emotionally? Maybe it is yeah, I'm never gonna make it anyways. I'm never gonna look that way anyways. So I might as well give up and just eat everything already. So I feel like with this example, maybe it makes more sense what I'm trying to get to, because for me, that was a big one, those negative thoughts that I had about myself, those self-sabotaging beliefs, not believing in myself and my ability to change, led me to eat emotionally. To further expand on these questions, do those thoughts trigger certain emotions that then trigger your emotional eating? Moving on to social and environmental triggers, the people we are with, where we are, can significantly influence our eating habits. Maybe some people make you feel bad about yourself, and that triggers emotional eating. Or the group pressure, everybody eats something, so you kind of feel like you have to as well, or the opposite way around. But here is, of course, about emotional eating. And also, cultural influences can lead to emotional cravings. So, how does location influence your eating habits? How does the time of day affect your eating? Maybe you always have the emotional cravings in the evening to wind down after the day. And how do other people influence your eating habits? And maybe ultimately compare ourselves to on social media. And those advertisements can trigger cravings because often they make us feel bad about ourselves. So often they can kind of bring those limiting beliefs or those negative thoughts up, which then trigger that emotional eating. So, how do advertisements or social media influence your cravings and eating habits? And what emotions do they trigger? We also often tend to reward ourselves with food. We associate food with a job well done, rewarding ourselves with food after achieving something, which can be fine. It's totally fine to treat yourself to some food as a reward, right? But first of all, maybe ask yourself, if your goal is to lose weight, does it make sense to reward yourself with food? Maybe try to reward yourself with something else. But overall, it can be fine to reward yourself with food. Like everything is fine in moderation. But if this reward is linked with other triggers, or if it triggers guilt, then there's the problem. If your goal is to lose weight, probably when you eat that, you feel guilty, or it triggers your negative body image, shame, and whatever. And then you tend to emotionally eat. Then you tend to binge and get into that negative emotional eating cycle. That's when the problem arises. So a question to ask yourself here is, do you use food as a reward for completing tasks or achieving goals? And how do you feel after eating? Because that's the important one here from what I just said, right? Then a last thing I want to mention is rigid lifestyle, trying to restrict certain foods, trying to avoid certain food and be rigid with your lifestyle, like how diets kind of try to make us act, can increase the desire for food and can increase cravings for the things that you try to restrict. So this could also then, because those cravings get strong, then we kind of end up eating that food because the restriction isn't sustainable, the craving gets too strong, and then you feel so bad about giving in that you ruin it all and you end up overeating, and the cycle continues once again. Reflecting on these questions that I mentioned and the triggers can help you identify your own patterns of emotional eating and help you develop strategies to better manage your emotions, to handle your emotional eating, hopefully in ways that benefit you. And this leads me to finally the strategies for managing your triggers that I want to share with you. So, strategy number one, or the thing number one I want to share with you, is to keep a food and emotion journal. Track what you eat, of course. So, whenever you eat something, you want to track what you eat and then how you feel physically, emotionally. It would also be beneficial to track where you are, what thoughts came up. So kind of like the things that we discussed now, like how these things show up when you eat, to get a better understanding of what makes you eat and of your eating habits. Like that, we can become aware of what influenced or triggered what specific emotions or events or whatever it is triggered that emotional eating. And you don't have to do it all the time, right? So I recommend maybe do it during 3 days, during a week that you choose. Hopefully not like months later when you've forgotten about it. So maybe as soon as possible, try to track that during 3 days, and maybe try to do one of those days on the weekend, because often on the weekend we eat a bit different than during the week. For me, most often, the emotional eating was much more present on the weekend because I kind of let loose and let myself enjoy food, but then felt guilty about it. This practice really helps you identify patterns and understand the connection between your emotions and your eating habits. And by understanding your triggers, you can begin to address them much more effectively. And for this, actually, once again, I want to mention my Notion journaling template because in there I also have I have basically exactly written how to use a food journal, and especially when it comes to emotional eating. So there is a journaling prompt, or like, how do you say, a template inside on how to use or how to do this kind of food journaling. So I highly recommend you check it out down in the links below. So moving on to the next practice, which is practice mindfulness and deep breathing. So whenever you feel triggered to eat emotionally, pause and take a few breaths. This simple act can help you become more present and aware of your emotions, reducing the impulse to eat. And I know this sounds super, super simple, but think about it. For me, this helped a lot because let's say you have that urge to whatever triggers you, you go to the fridge, you want to grab the chocolate, right? So before you open the fridge, take a moment to pause, breathe in, and become aware of why you want to eat right now. So if it's like we discussed now, an emotional trigger, an emotional hunger, ask yourself, you have the time by breathing and pausing. First of all, you have time to release some stress that makes you crave or that triggers more cravings, but also you have the time to reflect on what better way you could handle that emotion or that trigger, and what could you do now that would actually make you feel good. You have time to think about how you would feel if you eat, that you would end up feeling guilty and shamed and even eat more. So you have time to think about what you could do instead that is actually going to make you feel good in the long term and not just in the short moment after or during you eat. Lastly, create a self-care toolbox. So this means developing a set of alternative coping strategies that you can turn to when you're tempted to eat emotionally. So for example, as we talked before, in the moment where you pause and reflect, you could refer back to your emotional eating toolbox and find a better way to cope. So write down some strategies that will help you for each trigger so that you don't forget in the moment, and maybe save it in your phone. And for this, I want to, of course, share some ideas with you. Ask yourself, what are the things that help you soothe or feel more grounded when you're anxious? This could be deep breathing exercises, meditation, cuddling a pet, putting a cold washcloth over your face, practicing some kind of calming yoga pose like the child's pose, using essential oils. So you will ask yourself what usually makes you feel grounded when you feel stressed or anxious. Then when you're feeling lonely, ask yourself, what could you do instead of eating when you're feeling lonely? So this will be connection tools, right? This can be meeting up with friends outdoors or wherever, doing something fun with your partner or a loved one, calling or texting a friend. So there's many ways that we can connect with people that will actually fill up that void, or that will actually help us with feeling lonely. Because fact is, we can have so many people around and still feel lonely. Talking to someone for sure will help you more than numbing your feelings with food, if you're honest with yourself. Then what are some tools, some joy tools, things you can do when you need more joy in your life? So this could be watching a funny movie, listening to a funny podcast, playing a game on your phone, whatever brings you joy. Sometimes in the moments, it's actually so simple. We could do something that brings us joy, but the emotions overpower us and we tend to forget those things. That's why keep that emotional self-care toolbox handy somewhere with different tools or different ways of coping inside your phone so that you can always refer back to it in the moments of distress or whatever emotion you feel. And also some processing tools would be good. So how can you deal with your emotions and the situations that trigger them in healthier ways? You could journal about your thoughts and feelings. You could, again, call a friend and talk about the problem that triggers the urge to eat, the emotion that triggers you to eat. You can do deep breathing exercises. You could scream into a pillow to let it all out. Building healthy habits is about really finding what works for you. And besides those strategies, You also want to ensure that you're hydrated enough, because dehydration can further increase cravings. So, of course, we don't want to fight again the double side like with the stress. You want to make sure that you manage your stress properly. And then you also want to make sure that you're getting enough sleep. Not getting enough sleep also triggers cravings for food, because the body needs energy, and it gets energy from food if it doesn't get it from sleep. And be kind with yourself. Recognize that everyone has those moments. As I said, sometimes maybe I still have the urge, and maybe sometimes I eat emotionally, but I don't feel guilty about it, and I don't get triggered into that negative cycle of binging and all. And recognize that you don't have to do it perfect. It's progress over perfection. By implementing those strategies, you can start to break the cycle of emotional eating and develop a healthier relationship with food. Because emotional eating is a common challenge, and with the right strategies, and of course with the awareness before the strategies, you can build those healthier habits. And remember, small steps are much more valuable than trying to do everything at once and being perfect all the time, because often when we then slip up, we end up feeling guilty and the cycle once again starts. So if you found this episode helpful, please give it a thumbs up and maybe share it with someone who benefits it. And if you haven't already, subscribe, and hopefully enjoy more tips and insights into health and wellness in the future. So until next time, take care and be kind to yourself.